Cathedral. Today is the 7th of September, and I'm Edward Probert, the Canon Chancellor here. 7th of September. This announcement yesterday of the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, came with one or two interesting pieces of background information. I was interested to learn that there have been 15 Prime Ministers, and Liz Truss is the 15th of the present Queen's remarkably long reign. And even more remarkable is that in those 70 years of the Queen's reign, the last 6 years have seen 4 of those 15. And I think even more remarkable than that is that those 4 Prime Ministers in those 6 years have all come from the same political party. It's not that there's been a change of elections have resulted in new parties coming in and new wholesale new governments, but that each time it's the party of the governing Prime Minister which has ousted them. A really surprising fact. It did have certain resonances for me, listening to that. Just the coincidence of a name I trawled up from having studied Mexican history long years ago, when I studied rather than the history I'm talking about. During the 20th century, for coincidentally some 71 years, very similar length of time to the Queen's reign, Mexico was continuously governed by one party. It changed its name a couple of times, but for most of that time, the party was known as the PRI, the P-R-I, because it's a Spanish name. The adjectives and the nouns come in reverse order from English. PRI stood for the Institutional Revolutionary Party. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, a wonderfully paradoxical name, but it was that picture of a party continuing as an institution whilst behaving in a revolutionary way, which rather reminded me of our present party of government's approach. Unintentional, but a fact on the ground. We're a very different society from Mexico in the 20th century. But as you know, Britain has been largely a very stable country politically for an extremely long time, centuries you might say. Revolutions in our history are long in the past. These last few years, you'd have to say, remain therefore rather striking for the unstable arrangements at the heart of our government. And that kind of instability must surely have quite a lot of consequences. On the one hand, you could say that the institutional side of it, the same party staying in power, the same MPs largely in their seats on both sides of the House, that's continuity, and there's much to be said for that. But the churn in the leadership of that party and below the top level, in the cabinet posts, for example, and the ministerial posts, that really must have a lot of effects. Just this last few months, think of all those cabinet ministers who resigned a couple of months ago and were replaced, and now being replaced again, and then ministers below them being put in place. It must be very, very difficult for civil servants, for those taking direction from those at the top of the system. It must be very difficult for them to know what the direction of travel is, what policies to put forward, how to implement them. I must say, I ask myself these questions. When will we get a settled policy? When will people at those kind of levels feel confident about where things are going and how potentially destabilised, demoralised may all the people involved in all of this, once they get past the excitement of the day-to-day dynamics of politics at that level, how will they get on with it? Well, this year I found myself, this is now the third occasion, I found myself using prayers I've very rarely had cause to use, or in fact never had cause previously to use, from the Book of Common Prayer. One of my discoveries during the course of the year is that pretty much every copy of the Book of Common Prayer has the same pagination. So if I give you a page number, you could find this in your own copy, whatever edition it may be. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's the case. And as an example of this, on page 14 of my Book of Common Prayer, and I suspect yours too, I found myself on the Queen's Jubilee using the prayer for the Queen's Majesty, set there in morning prayer and also in evening prayer later on. On page 43, more recently, I found myself using, a couple of weeks ago, the second of the several Thanksgivings printed. The one above it I've used many times a year over the last 30 or 40 years. That's the general Thanksgiving, but the one underneath it, the second Thanksgiving, is for rain. And in the face of this drought, I gave thanks with that prayer for rain, for the coming of rain, when it began to rain again a couple of weeks ago. And now, a couple of pages before that one, on page 41, I'm going to finish this little musing with a prayer for the High Court of Parliament, which I invite you to share with me. Most gracious God, we humbly beseech thee, as for this kingdom in general, so especially for the High Court of Parliament, under our most religious and gracious Queen at this time assembled, that thou wouldst be pleased to direct and prosper all their consultations to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, the safety, honour, and welfare of our sovereign and her dominions, that all things may be so ordered and settled by their endeavours upon the best and surest foundations, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established among us for all generations. These and all other necessities for them, for us, and thy whole church, we humbly beg in the name and the mediation of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Saviour. Amen. Goodbye.